Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar called Particle Effects in Entertainment Creation Suites. And from wherever you are around the world, I'd like to welcome you to this technical presentation. And today we'll be talking about particle tools in Maya, 3ds Max and Softimage. And to present all these tools, I'll be joined by two of my colleagues. So myself, Louis Marcoux, will be presenting. And we'll also get Lee Fraser and Mark Schoennagel to present with me during this webinar. We all have our blogs on Area, so if you want to find out more about all the discussions we have today or technical discussions we have today, you can visit our blogs and find a lot more information about all the tools that we'll be showing you today. But before we go into the actual technical presentation, I want to just mention something that's coming up very soon, and that's an important event. I think it's a new event that you'll be excited about, and it's called CAVE.
Explore imagination.
So CAVE is a conference that will be focusing on creativity, but also will have some master classes and very advanced technical classes. So if you're into the media and entertainment industry, that's a conference that you'll be interested to go and come and see. So mainly what we'll have is of course, amazing keynotes. It's always the case, but also a lot of breakout sessions, master classes. There's going to be two parties, and also you'll have access to the AU opening keynote. AU is for Autodesk University, and the keynote is usually showing or discussing a lot of the new advanced or vision projects that the Autodesk is working on. So it's a very interesting keynote to attend. So it's a lot of stuff, and it's over 3 days. It's at the beginning of December, and it's kind of made of three parts. So the first part is just the CAVE event, which is focusing on creativity with all the keynotes that are focusing on creativity and the media entertainment industry. Then you'll have master classes, and it's set over 2 days. So you have a package where you can attend for 1 day, and the package where you can attend for 2 days. So it's very flexible, depending on your availability and budget. You can come in and attend all of these different aspects of AU and CAVE. So in the keynotes, we'll have people like Sid Mead, Neil Gaiman, Lorne Lanning, and John Cleese. So it's a very high-level profile speakers to the event there. And let's take a look at what they have to say.
If you're working in the movie industry, you have to be aware of what the public believes they'll believe.
What we're trying to do is mimic human emotions, and drawing is just a means of communicating your ideas.
For me, as a young artist, when I was looking at work that was really deep, I didn't really understand yet what was going on. I didn't really understand what was driving great production design, that it wasn't about just looking cool, that it had so many more layers of meaning.
Which is something so hard to do, not only, drawing, but drawing to tell a story and make it really feel honest and real.
So CAVE is also a lot of master classes, a ton of technical knowledge that you can learn from the conference, and you can take a look at the list here. You got a lot of visual effects, particle effects, destruction effects, and also rigging, facial setup, and all sorts of things. So it's a lot of content that will be offered at the conference. Also making of from industry leaders such as ILM, and also you'll have the presentation on Elysium, which is going to be extremely interesting. So that's for CAVE. I hope you can attend. That's going to be fun, and I'll be there. So if you join, just let us know, and we'll see you there. So ready to go into particle effects with the Entertainment Creation Suite. Our agenda for today. First, we're going to start with Maya particles and end particles with Lee Fraser. Then I'll cover particle flow and fume effects inside of 3ds Max. And also at the end, we'll have Mark Schoennagel talking about ice particles in Softimage. So let's get rolling, and Lee, you have the floor.
Thanks, Louis. Hey everybody, my name is Lee Fraser. I'm a technical specialist for Autodesk, and I'm going to take a brief look at in-particles inside of Maya today. First off, we'll just take a look at a couple of the advantages. One of the things I like about in-particles is it's tied to Nucleus. Nucleus is a common dynamics framework inside of Maya, which allows us to drive the animation of not only in-particles, but in hair, as well as in cloth and rigid bodies as well. This provides automatic interaction with all of these different dynamics bodies because they're tied to Nucleus. In-particles, as well as the other items that are tied to Nucleus, are very artist friendly. It provides sort of a single access point to a lot of the control that is covered in those different tools. In-particles are also well integrated, as well as Nucleus, to the rest of Maya. They can interact not only with each other, but they can take advantage of some of the capabilities of being able to create surfaces and curves and things inside of Maya, and we'll take a look at some of that today. As far as what this presentation is going to cover, I decided to pick out some specifics. First off, we'll just go over some of the tools inside of the in-particle system itself in terms of emitters and particle types and so forth. We'll also take a look at some of the collision capabilities. We'll take a look at the different forces or fields that drive the dynamic motion of in-particles. So in the case of something like a volume axis field, we can have very direct control. The Nucleus solver forces are just sort of a dynamic, built-in dynamic model that has wind and gravity. And then of course we can allow particles to enact on other things and act as forces themselves. We also can control in-particles with constraints because those are tied to Nucleus. So we can constrain particles to themselves or towards other dynamic objects. We can create output meshes within particles, as well as paint maps on other objects for control, which I think is a really cool thing. So let's start off with taking a look at the different emitter types inside of Maya for in-particles. First off, we've got point, volume, directional, surface, and curve. These are somewhat self-explanatory, but the point emitter is just an omnidirectional emitter that sends particles in all directions. The volume emitter, it has specific control as it relates to the different volumes that you can create. There's a torus that you can see there, but we can also, of course, emit from spheres and cubes and cylinders and so forth. There's also very precise directional control within those volumes. The directional emitter is very similar to a point emitter in that it emits particles from a point, but in this case, obviously, they are just directional, and there's some capabilities with controlling how those emit in a direction from that point. Surface emitters can be emitted from vertex positions or from the surface as a whole. The curve emitter is the same in that it can emit from the vertices, or it can also emit all along the different points on the curve. So that's just a look at the emitter types. There are also controls that allow for direct manipulation on all of those emitters. You can hit the T key and get access to things like rate, speed, min-max, direction. On the directional emitter, you can control the cone angle and so forth, and that's just kind of a handy way of gaining control over those emission qualities or emission parameters directly on the manipulator instead of going to the attribute editor. Different particle types, you can see there that we have points on the left, balls, cloud, thick cloud, as well as water. And this doesn't just create a different look for the particle, it also drives things like water dynamics. In the case of the water type of particle, it enables certain qualities in the attribute editor that allow for different types of motion for that type of particle. So let's take a look at the particle tools first off. The different particle tools just basically allow you to populate the different types of particles inside your scene. The particle tools are found under the In Dynamics menu, and we can look under the Create In-Particles section and find the In-Particle tool. If we bring up the option box, we can see that by default, it just creates one particle at a time. And if I click in the viewport here, you can see little red crosshairs get created, and as soon as I hit enter, I get particles at the location of those crosshairs. So that's one handy way of directly manipulating the particles. Of course, we can also increase the number of particles as well as the maximum radius. So as we start to populate spots in our scene, multiple particles get created with a radius that we dictate in the attribute editor or the options of the tool, and you can see there that we get a nice particle cloud. But one of the cool things about the particle tool is that you can also sketch particles. I'm going to decrease this radius just a little bit, and we'll leave the number of particles created at a higher number. This sketch interval is how frequently the particle tool is going to drop one of those little checkbox. And you can see here it's really easy to create just sort of a particle direction or a particle cloud that is very specific in shape just by sketching in the viewport. The InParticle tool can also be used to create a grid of particles. If I just click on two extremes in the viewport, you can see I get a 2D grid corresponding to those corners. Let's delete that really quickly. Another way of using this is with text fields. You can see that I get entries in here that correspond to the last value that I created. In this case, we'll just create some arbitrary values. And once we're done, we can click in the viewport and hit enter, and we get a 3D grid of particles. Another common way of introducing particles to your scene is by selecting objects and going to the Emit from Object menu and opening this up. And in this case, we can just click on Curve. When we hit play, you can now see that we get particles emitted all along our curve. Same thing goes for the surface. We can just select Create InParticles and go to Emit from Object. In this case, I'm going to select Surface in the Attribute Editor, and I get particles that come off of the surface as well. So those are two really quick ways of introducing particles to your scene. The last way of introducing particles in your scene that I'll take a look at is one that's pretty unique and one that I like a lot, and that's to fill an object. So in this case, you can see we've got a spiral tube. If we go down to our Fill Object menu, we get presented with some different options, but primarily we want to pay attention to the resolution. We can use double walled, so if this object has thickness, we could fill just the thick parts instead of just the entire interior section. But in this case, when we hit particle fill, the entire object gets filled with particles based on that piece of geometry. So we can hide that, and you can see now that we get particles based on that individual piece of geometry. And if we turn on Use Plane and hit play, we will get the particles playing back, and they do the things that you would expect. So that is Fill Object. If we, of course, turn that object on and make that a passive collider, they're going to slide down and come out just like they would a normal tube and collide with that object. So that is Fill from Object, and there's all kinds of things, as you can imagine, that you can use this for. Next, let's take a look at a couple of different collision examples. Collisions for InParticles are pretty straightforward since they're tied to nucleus. The main thing to know is there is true volume collision, so they are detecting the edge of the particles themselves, and of course they can collide within themselves or within a particle system. Nucleus collisions are pretty cool in that automatically InParticles collide with in-hair as well as in-cloth and rigids, so there's no setup involved. Let's take a look at how this all works. Here we have a pretty straightforward InParticle scene. We've got a couple of in-rigids that are driving the direction of a couple of different InParticles systems, a yellow one and a purple one. And we have an in-hair system blocking the way of the yellow particle system. And everything's pretty much taking equal precedence. You can see that the yellow and purple ones are mixing together pretty nicely. The volume collisions are pretty easy to see, that they are interpenetrating each other. And the self-collision is turned on both particle systems, so you can see that they are maintaining their true volume within each particle system as well. As for the in-hair, you can see that the yellow particles are sort of pushing those out of the way as they sort of hit a critical mass and push, they gain enough mass to push the in-hairs out of the way. But we might want this to happen in a little different fashion, and there's a couple of ways that we can do that. First off, if we hit play through a couple of frames here, and we take the purple particles, there is a section that's called Dynamic Properties, and if you go down to the bottom, there is a mass section. If we turn this up, let's turn it way up to something like 100 and hit play, you can see that now the purple particles are obviously going to take major precedence over the yellow particles, and they're going to push those out of the way because the volume or the mass is much heavier. Now in this case, I may not want that extra mass on that particular particle system. So another way of controlling this is by using collision layers. Now collision layers by default are everything within a nucleus dynamic system, everything's on the same collision layer. But by changing those layers, you can dictate which objects collide with other objects, or which nucleus objects collide with other nucleus objects. So you can either turn them on or off, or you can have them take precedence over one another. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the collision layer of this in-hair, and I'm going to turn it up to 1. It could be 2, it could be 1. In this case, we'll turn it up to 1. We're going to leave the yellow particles at a value of 0, And I'm actually going to turn the purple particles up to a collision layer of 1 as well. So what's going to happen is the lower collision layer is going to take precedence over the upper collision layer. It's going to get solved first, and it's going to have a similar effect to what the mass did, but it's going to behave a little bit differently. They're still going to seem like they have the same weight. First of all, you can see that they have a major impact on the in hair. It moves those out of the way pretty heavily. And the purple particles are getting sort of pushed aside from, or the purple particles are getting pushed out of the way by the yellow particles, and they're sort of getting biased over to the one side. So this is a great way of controlling particles with something that doesn't change their dynamics properties. So there's lots of ways of doing this. Of course, another way is to change the collision layer to something that's outside what's called the collision layer range. In this case, the collision layer range is set to 3. So if I set this collision layer of this tube up to something like 6, it's going to be outside that collision layer range, and now these particles aren't going to know that it exists, and they're going to pass through that. The next thing we'll take a look at, or let's take a look at the next subject, which is forces. Forces inside of Maya are essentially fields that push objects around that are dynamic. You can think of gravity and wind as pretty simple examples of being able to push, in this case, in particles around in our scene. The volume axis field is one of my favorites, so we'll take a look at that. And nucleus solver forces are just convenient built-in forces within the nucleus solver that allow you to drive, in this case, in particles around the scene. So for just the straight nucleus particles, we'll go back to our in particle tool, and I'm just going to drop down a grid just like we did before. We'll stick the particles in the middle of the scene using the 2 check marks like we did before in the first example using the in particle tool, and now we can drive these particles. By default, if I hit play, they just drop because they're tied to the nucleus internal field, which is what we mentioned before. So if you open up the nucleus node in the attribute editor, you can see that there's gravity, direction, and some basic wind attributes, and these all determine how these particles fly around by default. I can turn on use plane, and if I let them fall, you can see that they bounce directly on the grid. But the thing we want to look at mainly is just the gravity and the direction, as well as things like the air density. In this case, we'll use the wind speed, and I'm going to turn this direction to 0, and we'll increase the downward force of these, and I'm just going to turn up the wind noise. And by default, you can see that these start to behave pretty heavily in terms of, especially if we increase the wind noise as well as the wind speed, they start to behave pretty determinedly towards the ground. Of course, they're wiggling around because the wind is driving them in the direction of the ground. If I turn this up to 0.5, of course, they're going to fly upwards in the air. So there is some basic control that the nucleus node gives you that allows you to start playing around with the way the particles behave. I'm going to turn all these values back down, and we'll talk a little bit about the volume axis field. The other thing I'm going to tell the particle system that I want it to do is to ignore the solver gravity. So when I hit play, nothing's going to happen. So basically I can position these wherever I want in the scene. The next thing I'm going to do is use a volume axis field to control how these behave. We're just going to quickly create a CV curve, and we'll have this wiggle around through the inside of this. Not really paying a whole lot of attention how I draw this, because what I'm going to do is go into my fields menu and use a volume curve to drive this. Now the attributes on this are found in the attribute editor again. We can leave the magnitude as it is, but the main thing I want to do is increase the radius of these sort of circles. If I hide the particle system, you can see them a little bit better. There's a volume or a radius around the curve that's created. So we'll bring back the particles. We'll go into the volume axis field, and I'm going to increase the volume control. So you can see that there is a section radius. We'll increase that. We can change that along the length of this. You can see as I move this around, this can have different lengths down the length of the axis field itself. In this case, I kind of like it being even all the way along the side. And then what I want to do is increase the along axis value. And from there, I just have to attach it. I just have to tell Maya that I want the affected object or the object that I've got selected as the affected object, and when I hit play, you can see that those particles move along, or at least initially in the direction of that volume axis field. The one thing that we want to do is trap the particles inside that radius. So all we have to do is go back to the volume axis field, and there's a trap inside value. So as I increase this value, there's a couple of things that happens. I have a trap ends and a trap radius. So I can have that be a little bit larger than the actual radius of the circumference itself, but you can see now that these sort of shoot off into the direction that they're traveling. If I trap the ends, they sort of bunch up at the end. And if we want to slow this down, we can do that just by selecting the particle and going in, and you can either turn the conserve value down just a little bit. That's one way of controlling that, and we can, as we start to turn that down, you can see that they move a little bit more slowly and they bunch up at the end. So the volume axis field is a really great way of controlling that. And the last thing that we can do with that is, of course, have these travel around the inside of this. So if I say, if I increase the around axis value, you can see that they sort of start traveling around in sort of a circular fashion. So that's a really cool way of controlling this. And if you think about how you can animate curves and all the different things that you can do with curves as it relates to this, this is a great way of getting particles to do exactly what you want them to do. The last thing that we'll take a look at is controlling animation with constraints, as well as painting maps on things like rigid objects to get the particles to travel and stick to surfaces and do some different things based on some sort of texture map, and whether that map's procedural or one that you paint yourself. So let's take a look at how that works. In this first example, you can see that we've got our grid of particles again and a couple of collision objects. And if we just hit play, you can see that those just sort of are free to act however they want. They're just being controlled by gravity. And I might want to have a little bit better control over those. And there's a couple of ways of doing that. One is we can go in and constrain these using a transform constraint. And in this case, if I hit the transform constraint and hit play, the only one that gets constrained is the one that I have selected. So we can control that a little differently and maybe pin one side of those and then select the rest of the particles and go into the in constraint menu and use a component to component constraint. Now this is just one constraint. You can see the others in the list there. And what happens is, again, we get a little bit of control. And you can see a few of those get tied together, but the rest of them sort of are free to act however they want. And that's because the settings in the dynamic constraint are set to nearest pairs. And what I want to do in this case is use the max distance value, and I'm just going to dial that up, and you'll see if we go into wireframe and zoom in a little bit here, you'll start to see a component show up in between these particles. Now in this case, at a setting of 1, they're looking a little closer to each other and overlapping. At 0.5, you can see that they're getting a little bit closer. And if we go to something like 0.6, we get a nice grid that's evenly spaced and sort of a, well, actually a grid between those particles. So you can play around with those values to get some different results. But if we go back and hit play again, now those particles will hold together and they act a little bit more like cloth. And you can, there's some correlations between this and cloth, but this is just one that works really well. And you can see they sort of a little springy and loose. We can up values like stickiness and some other things that will give us some different results. But the other thing we're going to look at on the constraint is this glue strength value. So if we start to dial this down a little bit, depending on how fast those particles are moving, they'll start to stretch and pull apart. And you can see right up here at that one transform constraint, there's a little bit too much weight and it broke. And now you can see the result there, and they sort of tear in the middle. And you can get some really interesting results out of this. Of course, we can convert this to a mesh and get some other results as well. But that's just a simple way of looking at how you can control constraints or end particles with those constraints and some of the other values. And there's a lot of different information in here, but for the time we've got today, that's just one simple example. So let's take a look at how we can control these using maps. In this last example, controlling particles using a painted texture map or procedurals is a really powerful way of controlling how particles behave. And in this case, we're going to look at how we can control the flow of these particles along this collision surface. By selecting these end particles, we can take a look at some of the values that we've changed. I've got a little bit of a stickiness value on them to control how they interact with each other. So they're sort of piling up like concrete in this case. If we select the surface, we've turned up the value to 1 so that we can paint against that value for the control of the particles on the surface. So to paint the map, all we have to do is go into the InMesh menu. We can go into Paint Texture Properties and pick stickiness. Obviously you can see there's a lot of other maps that we could paint textures for to control the flow of the particles, but in this case painting black or painting a little bit lighter value than black on this will allow us to start controlling how they flow on the surface. So I'll paint just sort of an initial section here where they won't be quite as sticky, and then I'm going to paint a really dark value to kind of give them a chance to flow down this surface. So as they come into contact with that dark value, they'll start to flow a little bit, and as they find those channels where it's darker black, you'll start to see them travel down those channels as the mass of the particle starts to build up. Remember, they've got a little bit of a stickiness value within the end particle shape themselves. So now you can start to see down those fingers, they're either going to start to travel down, and some of these are going to sort of hit an escape velocity and they'll travel off the side of the surface, and some of them will hit the edge of that map and start to stick by themselves. And as the particles build up, you'll see them start to extend down the side of the surface more and more. So this is just a really simple example, as I showed you before. Being able to control all of those different channels that are available to you within that paint tool section is pretty powerful. Also, you can drive these with animated procedural ramps. There's a lot of different capabilities within the paint texture tool as it relates to end particles. So hopefully in this brief presentation you've been able to gain some new ideas and understanding of what end particles can be used for. Obviously dynamic effects is one of those: wind, rain, snow, bullets, explosions. There's all kinds of things that end particles can be used for. I also like to use them for motion graphics. The randomness that you can create and the control that you've gained that you can have access to within the end particle system can be driven by so many different things. It makes it easy to use and good for quick turnaround type of effects. So I'm going to turn it back over to Louis. Thank you for your time.
For 3ds Max, the most flexible particle system is called PFlow or PFlow, and it's a node-based particle system that you can use to build all sorts of events, and all of those events allow you to kind of define the story of your particles. Those events are made by operators and tests, and by combining all of them you can create all sorts of particle effects. Also, it's integrated with Mass Effects that allows you to do some simulation effects as well. And you can build your own custom operators and test if you know how to build some more complex mathematical formulas and things like that. But it's a very easy to use system that allows you to extend the basic particle system inside of 3ds Max. The particle flow system is also extendable with very popular plugins like Fume Effects and Krakatoa, among just to name a few. So what I'll do now is I'll just go into the S-Max, and my goal here is to build an event-driven particle system. And there's no Max demo without a teapot, so we're going to use a teapot. And my goal is to bring in particles into this world here, and they're going to gather around the teapot. I'm going to recreate the shape of the teapot, and after a few moments, they're going to go and they're going to break this structure here. So I've got 300 frames for my animation. I'm going to break it in 3 parts. So the first 100 frames is going to be a kind of a water or fluid simulation of the particles falling on the ground and spreading. From 102 to 200, they're going to gather around the teapot and going to recreate the shape of the teapot. And from 200 to 300, they're just going to fire at this structure here, and they're going to break it into pieces. So that's where particle flows excels, is that by creating this story, we can define different events, and they're going to create our particle system. So the particle flow is in the graph editor. You go in particle view here, or you can press the 6 key, and I'm going to use the 6 key a lot in this presentation. It just brings the particle view, and this is the window where you create all the particle effects. All of the operators and tests are at the bottom. They are color coded, so you see that everything that's yellow is a test, and everything else here is blue, and we also have the green ones here. We represent the physics simulation tool. So when you start a new particle system, you need to create a berth, and there's a few options to create flows. It's a set of operators that will give you automatically a few particles in your scene. So if I want to bring in an M particle, it's going to create a Mass Effects particle system. That's why the M at the beginning here says for Mass Effects, and it's going to create a grid with a shape, and I'm just going to minimize this and show you what we have so far. So this is what we have. They are falling down, and they're just going to be, spreading like this, simulated by physics. So that's event number 1. You see this is one event, and I can start to change the event here. My goal is to, at the beginning, is have the water, create kind of a water effect of the particle spreading. So I'm not going to use a grid. I'm going to change the shape here to a sphere. and I'm going to change that to a sphere. And I can use any other shape inside of 3ds Max. Those are just basic shapes. I'm going to make them a bit smaller, so maybe a value of 1 here will be good. I'm going to simulate the MP shape. Here's the simulation shape, so I'm going to simulate that as a sphere as well, and I'm going to leave it the rest as so. So if I just press play now, we have those spheres and they're just going to fall on the ground. It's not really the effect that I want. I want to create the particles a bit differently. So I'm going to bring back particle flow, and instead of using a birth grid, I'm going to change that to a birth stream. So it's a stream of particles coming into the scene. Right now we're emitting from 0 to 30, so I'm just going to say from 0 to 70. I'm going to create a bit more particles, maybe a 500 as a rate. I can make it bigger at the end if I want to have more particles. And the separation of those particles, I'll just say 0.5 or 6 inches in this case here. The speed is kind of fast. I'm going to bring it back to 20, and now we have something that works a little bit better. So if I just rewind and play, you'll see that we have a stream of particles coming in from frame 0 to frame 70. But what you can do as well is that I'm just going to bring in the select by scene, and the birth stream here comes in with an icon. It immediately adds an icon to your scene, and you can place this icon wherever you want. So if I just place it up there and above the teapot, so if I just press play now, the particles will just fall around the teapot, and they will just continue like so forever. Right now there's only one event, and this event is just simulating the spheres just falling on the ground and spreading like water. So now that this is done, I can start to bring it a bit further. So from frame 100 to 200, I want the particles to gather around the teapot to create the shape of the teapot. So to do that, I'm going to put a test in here to change the event. I'm going to bring in an age test. You have all sorts of tests like collision tests, acceleration tests, and speed tests and things like that. But right now I'm just going to use an age test, and I'm going to say for absolute age, which is the timeline age, if you say, I'm going to say after 100 frame with a variation of 10, so they don't all leave at 100 and go to the other event. They're going to slowly grow from 90 to 110 and slowly gradually go to the other event. And that other event will be, I'm going to use a find target, and the find target, I'm going to connect it here. The find target, I want all the particles to find the teapot. Right now they're going to display as ticks, but I'm going to change to geometry, and you see that the display here and the display don't have the same color, and that's kind of intended. You can make that exactly the same if you want to, or you can apply a material if you want to, but right now I'm going to use these colors to kind of debug or know that my particles are going from one event to the other. So my find target, the speed here is kind of very high, so I'm going to make it a bit smaller. Variation be something like 5. The acceleration limit is very high as well, so I'm going to make it to 20. So they're going to turn around and kind of go towards the teapot and not just change abruptly their trajectory and speed up to the teapot. They're going to go in the same speed. Right now they're going to target an icon. That's not what I want. I want to target a mesh, and that mesh will be my teapot. So select the teapot, and I want all the particles to go at a random point on the teapot. So if I just minimize this and press play, you'll see that my particles will go down, and after around frame 100, they're going to start to change color, and you see that they go towards the teapot. But you see that now they're continuing their path. As soon as they touch the teapot, they just continue in a straight direction. So I would like them to stop on the teapot and stay attached to the teapot. So we have another operator here that allows it to do that. It's the lock and bound. It's kind of a very flexible operator here, but it allows me to go around the teapot or kind of lock to it very precisely. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to connect that here, and I'm going to again display as the geometry, and we're going to go into the lock and bound. I want to lock to what? To the teapot, and we're going to lock to the surface, to the animated surface, snap the surface, and we're going to restrict to the surface here. You see that we have some forces there that allows us to have the particles go around the teapot and kind of circle around with the shape of the teapot. But right now I want them to just restrict to the surface and stick to the surface. So if I just press play now, we're going to see that we have the water stream effect. They're going to go to the teapot, and as soon as they stick to the teapot is animated, and it turns around, and those particles just stick to it, and they stay there until frame 300. So now we have the teapot being shaped. I'm going to hide the teapot, and if you look at the particle system, we're starting to get our effect of the particles creating the shape of that teapot here, and being ready to fire to that structure here. So right now there's no fire to the structure. We're going to do that event now. So after it's lock and bound, I'm going to add another test, and that age test will be from particle age something like 200. And again, I'm going to put some variation, maybe of 10, so that they don't all leave at the same time. They're going to create a trail of particles. And what I want them to do is I want them to find another target. I'm going to use the target here and connect that. And I'm going to display as geometry again. And now what we have is that the find target will kind of rush with the speed of 200. So I'm going to change that to something like maybe 100, variation again of maybe 10 or something like that. And the acceleration limit, I'm going to leave it like so that it's really like going quickly towards the icon. So now we're not going to target a mesh, we're going to target an icon, and I'm going to make it so that it goes to the closest point on the surface of the icon. When you add the icon here, it creates the icon in your scene, so you can place it here. I'm going to place it behind the structure. So now what we're going to get is, before I do this, I'm going to make sure that we are displaying the geometry. Yes, that's good. So I'm going to press play, and we're going to get our entire effect of the particles gathering together, creating the seed pot, and then firing towards the structure. But now what we'd like to do is we'd like to destroy or break that structure as it's being hit by those particles. And to do that, we're going to use a different approach here. What I'll do is I'll bring back particle flow. We saw how we create those first events to create the stories of our particles. I'm going to do another set of events. I'm going to create a new M particle flow, same thing as before. And instead of making it separate, I'm going to connect this here to my main node here, which is my render node. I don't necessarily need 2 render nodes. I'm just going to use only one. And you see that now we're creating a grid. It's made of cubes. It's the same thing as before. It has a spin operator by default. I don't want that, so I'm going to delete that spin operator. And I'm going to minimize this here to see what we have. So we have still our, but you see that it's kind of slowing down. And it's because now we have 2 simulation worlds. We have this world here and this world here. So we would like them to be simulated in the same environment. So what I'll do here is I'll just delete that world here, and I'll copy this one, and I'll paste it as an instance inside of this operator here. And now they're both simulated in the same world, and it's going to be a bit faster to simulate, which is great because now those particles will be able to interact with each other. So the shape of the cube is kind of big now, so I'm going to reduce that to a value of 5, so that all of the cubes will be of a size of 5, as you can see here. So they're a bit more spread, but it created a grid icon, and that's where the icon is, and I can place this grid wherever I want inside of the scene here. So I'm going to place it at the center of this geometry, and I can use the icon to change the size. So I'm going to make it a bit higher, and also the grid size, you see that now it's at 10, so I'm going to say 5.1, and you see that they're going to go very close to each other. And that's intentional because my goal here is to kind of wrap this geometry with particles here. So I'm going to extend the width so that we have this old geometry like so, and then I'm going to restrict the mesh, restrict the particle emission by a mesh, and I'm just going to pick that mesh here. Now you can see we have our particles, and the mesh is kind of being mimicked by particles. I can hide that pillar, and you can see that now we have our particles, and they're just falling down like so. And that's my goal, is to have the particles shaped like the object, and now they're just falling down and nothing interesting happens. So I'm going to change a few things in our event. Right now they're all falling down. We would like all these particles to act as a single object. So we have an operator that allows you to do that. It's called the MP glue, or the M particle glue. And I'm going to base it on distance. I know that all of my cubes are have a size of 5, so I'm going to make the bind distance maybe to 10. I'm going to allow multiple penetration and say maybe 8. I want them to be breakable by force, and a good starting point would be 1,000 here, and I'm just going to leave it there for now, and we could tweak that if we wanted to. And so whenever the force, or if it's being if the gravity is too strong, if there's a force like a wind that's too strong, or if it's being hit by an object, that's kind of the forces that will allow us that will allow the particles to break. And whenever they break, they're going to come out of here. But right now we're just going to allow them to break. And if I press play here, you see that the object is kind of behaving a bit more like a single object. Of course, you can adjust the spring value and the extendable value and all of that. But right now what I want to do is I want to simulate all of this as a single object, like so. But I don't want to simulate this from the starting point. We want to simulate this when the particles here will be close to this object. So what I'll do is I'll bring in an operator called an MP switch, and the MP switch allows me to go in and say, I want to turn off the simulation. on a specific interval, and I'll say I know that the particles are being fired at around frame 200, so I'll say until frame 215, it's going to be turned off in simulation. So if I press play now, the simulation will be off, and actually it's close to the ground here, so I'm going to press play again, and here we go, it's out of the ground, so we don't have these spinning particles here. So it's not simulated until frame 215, but right now the particles that it will be hit by are in this event here when the find target is going, when the particles are trying to find that target, but there's no operators here that allows us to bring those particles into the simulation. So to do this, I'm just going to copy the MP shape and the world. I'm going to copy those and I'm going to paste them as instance in this event. So now the shape is being simulated and the world, it's the same world of simulation, so it's all going to be working all together. But the thing here is that those particles, if I do the simulation here, they're going to fall down with gravity, and that's not really what I want. I would like them to be kinematics particles, so they're going to be affecting my structure, but they're not going to be falling down as they go through it. So I'm going to bring in an MP switch, and for this MP switch, I'm going to say turn off the simulation in the event. So they're going to continue to go find that target, but they are going to be collision particles. So let's take a look at what we have so far. I'm going to press play. We're going to have our particles falling down, then creating the teapot, and when the teapot is created at frame 200, it's going to fire to this, and it's going to break that, and you see that it's all going to be, you know, exploding and all of that. So those are particles, but what we would like to get in the end is the actual pillar to being destroyed and not particles. So what I'll do is I'll bring back the pillar here. I'm going to select it, and you see that we've subdivided it, and there's a few. The reason why we subdivided it is we are going to use the particles as bones to drive the shape of this object. So to do that, there's a special modifier called particle skinner. And the particle skinner allows you to use or to skin two particles, basically. So what I'll do here is I'll just go in and I'll say I want to skin to the particle flow source. Not all of the particle flow events. If I take a look at this here, I don't want I don't want to deform based on the liquid here, but only on this event here, which is event number 5. So I'll say add by list, and I'll say event number 5. And because the particles will break at some point, I'll say it's possible to rip the surface apart based on the binding break. And now we can activate the skinning, and I can, now that I know that the particles are working well, I'm going to leave them in the scene as a simulation, but I'm going to turn off the display. And now what we're going to get is our particles are we're going to let play the full effect, but they're going to gather around, create the teapot, and when they're going to fire to the object, you'll see that the object is going to start to break into pieces because it's skinned to the particles. I'm going to pause this for a second. I'm going to grab this here. You see that all of these are they have no thickness. So I can go in here and say I want to add a shell modifier. It's going to recalculate this, and it's going to allow me to add some depth to all of these debris. So the mesh is being broken into smaller pieces, but they don't have any depth. So no outer amount, but only some inner amount. So just give it some thickness like so. And now we have our effect, our full effect of our particles and the objects being broken into pieces. So just to give you an idea of how the particle system will integrate with other plugins such as FumeFX or Krakatoa, I want to show you how you can turn this particle system into into fire and smoke and all of that. So if I want all of my particles here to be made of fire, I can use FumeFX for that. So if I want to use FumeFX, what I'll do is I'll go back here. I'll turn off my my particle skinner, turn it off for now, go back to 6 here, and I'm going to turn off that event. I don't need to this event to do the simulation. My goal is to turn all of these events here into a FumeFX or kind of fluid fire smoke simulation. So I'm going to use only those particles as my source of fire. And the way that FumeFX works is pretty simple to use. You go into the creation panel. Once FumeFX is installed, and again, FumeFX is not coming by default with 3ds Max. You need to get it from Sydney Satney. So you can go and visit their website and you can take a look at the FumeFX plugin. So I just want to show you how well it's integrated with PFlow so that you can create all sorts of effects. I'm going to go in here and add a FumeFX primitive, and it's basically a region with a grid, and that's going to be the simulation area for our fire. And once you've got that grid, you can go in and show the dialog. And the dialogue, yes, it could be daunting at the beginning, but it's very simple to get going with fume effects. All of these are adjustments that you can make to have more turbulence or adjust the fire or smoke or even the color and all of that. But right now what we want to do is we want all those particles to be fire. So I'm going to go in and say which objects in my scene are in fire or are on fire. I'm going to say particle source. Which particles? This is the particle flow operator here. You need to define the temperature. So I'll say 1000, which is a good temperature for burning all of these particles. In my simulation here, I can say I want to have a bit of turbulence. So let's say a value of 1. The turbulence noise, you can define the scale. So maybe 10 with 10 here, 10 with a bit of details, maybe 5 details. We're going to have much more detail here. And at the bottom here, you've got some tools to add extra detail to the fire and the smoke and all of that. So once you've got that, if I just press play here, you'll see that all of the particles will be surrounded by a little circle. And that means that all of these particles are now being considered to be on fire. So when you're ready to do your simulation, I can enable the preview window, and the preview window will allow you to see this here. So if I press play, you'll see that the fume effect simulation will happen. And you see that immediately we start to see that all of those particles are on fire. And if I just stop it for a second, and I'm going to rewind it by 1 frame so that the frame is here. So as you are within your scene, the simulation has already happened, so you can go a bit closer and say, well, the smoke is way too white. So I'm just going to go back into my rendering here, and I can change the smoke color to something a bit more, something like grayer. So let's say blacker or something like this. And you can start to change your settings. And of course, it's just a rough preview, but it allows you to start making decisions about how you want that fire to look. But once you do this completely, I've prepared that, and I've loaded it in the RAM player here. And this is how the effect could look like when you use fume effects to turn your particles into fire. So you see that this is going to transform it into a teapot, then it's going to fire at this object here. And you can do all of these things, combine all of these operators together to create your final effect. So that's an overview of how to use PFlow and particles inside of 3ds Max.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee. And thanks, Louis, as well, for those 2 great demos of the Max and the Maya particle systems. So last up, we're going to take a look at the Softimage particle system, which is going to be found within inside ICE, or the Interactive Creative Environment in Softimage. My name is Mark Schoennagel. I'm a Senior Technical Specialist here at Autodesk in the Media and Entertainment Division. And like I said, we're going to be taking a look at ICE and some of the advantages of using ICE. So before we get started, just a few little words about it. First, it's a fully multi-threaded visual programming language, which is really important to know. As your workstation scales, the performance of ICE will scale. Today's demo is going to be done on a laptop. It's a fairly powerful laptop. Unfortunately, the software that records the screen, especially when dealing with fast motion like particles, really kind of puts a hamper on our frame rates, but you'll see it's still a very fast system as well. It's node-based. It allows us to procedurally manipulate particles and vertices. It's very similar working with particles or vertices or points, whichever. It's just just an XYZ coordinate at the end of the day. So how you get it from position A to position B is very similar. And ICE is both artistic friendly and TD friendly, which means as the artist uses a node that a TD creates, they're not, the UIs are very similar. It's a very comfortable feeling when working with tools created with ICE. And there's also lots of technical artists out there that can code their own ICE nodes as well. And with that, there's both basic and advanced workflows, which kind of correspond to the artist-friendly and the TD-friendly aspects of ICE. Some key features, there's multiple dynamic solvers. There's the standard ICE solver. We have Bullet Physics. We have the Lagoa solver. We have the Cyflex Cloth from one of our partners. There's a full crowd simulation tool set in there, so if you're doing massive crowd simulations, not a problem. As I mentioned before, we can control both particles and points. We can do deformation, shattering, strands, all types of different particle effects, liquids, goos, strands, as I mentioned. And there's also some great performance and debugging tools, which allow you to get your simulations working as fast as possible and also make sure that they're bug-free if you're actually writing code. And again, it's all visual code. And lastly, it's extremely fast. So you'll see, as you're working with ICE again, especially on a multi-core workstation, it really performs extremely well. So anyway, now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at Softimage, and we're just going to take a look at a little basic scene and kind of work on a little fire effect and maybe play with a few other different Lagoa materials at the end of the demo. So what I've set up here really quickly is just a little cauldron kind of hanging over some rocks and some pieces of wood there. They're going to be our fire emitter. And again, I got this little cauldron here. So just to get started, rather than dive in and start plugging nodes in, kind of manually, I'm going to use some of the automated preset tools for you. And this is some of the basic workflows that I was mentioning earlier. So what I could do here is just say, all right, with my firewood there selected, I'm going to come over here and say, okay, I want to create a particle. Now I want to create a basic emission, rigid bodies, a blast, basic fire, cigarette smoke, bubbles, trees, liquid, jello, breakable structures, strands, all kinds of different basic effects that I can create. Well, let's just start off with a basic fire, and let's just see what happens. So when I did that, this little 3-node ice tree appeared here. We had this nice little dialog box pop up, and if I press the play key or simulate, we see some fire. So this is great. So there we go. We got these little particles moving around, and I can start to control them. I can make the size bigger. I can make it smaller, all just by moving this slider here. If I change the Perlin factor, you can see these are getting a lot more noisier. I can change the complexity here if I want. And all I'm really doing is changing parameters that are driving these input ports. So if you'll notice, size, directional factor, directional factor. Each one of these inputs represents a slider or some type of parameter on this page. So here I'm controlling all of the particle sizes, but if I were to grab a node and plug it into this size, then I would be able to control the particles on a per particle basis. So let's just go ahead and show you how all that's done. So what I'm going to do is just start from scratch rather than use this preset that's already created. And I'm just going to select these the logs again here. I'm going to say ice, create, and this time I'm going to do a basic emission. And the basic emission is going to create another basic ice tree for me. I'm just going to space this out a little bit so we can see this clearer. I'm going to expand all of these. And again, this is what happens when you just do a basic emission. This is the nodal representation for our emitter, the logs. This is the emit from geometry compound. And if I double click on it, it's basically this dialog box right here that all of these parameters are associated with. And here I can start to tune some of my particle effects. And then my simulation route, this is where we plug forces in. This is where we plug in state machines. And I must say one thing, using the software to record the screen really takes a dramatic impact on my frame rate. This is normally about 200 or 300 frames a second, and right now I'm only at about 50. So we're losing a lot of the horsepower just recording the screen. But anyway, still not too shabby. But anyway, let's go ahead and start to tune some of these parameters that are here on our emit from geometry compound. So first we'll go ahead and maybe increase the number of particles to say 4,000, and you can see we got 4,000 particles there, or maybe 40,000. And that's per second. So there's 40,000 per second. You can see it's still performing very well. Let's bump this maybe back down to say 4,000 for a second, and let's go ahead and change the size. You can see it's not really doing anything because I'm emitting points. So if I change that to a sphere or a cube, now you can see those are going to be different sizes. But you can also see they're all uniform sizes. So every one of these spheres, every one of these particles has a size of 6.12 on them. What if I want to have random sizes, or what if I want to put turbulence on those values? Well, to do that, I need to basically plug in a node to override that rate parameter. Now I can either do that by looking through my long list here of nodes that I have with ice, which we'll do that in a bit. But let's first just go up here to the pull down, and we'll just take a look at some of these parameters we can do here using some of the more basic workflow. I'll just do how about a randomized size, and what that did is it automatically attached the randomized size to the input, and you can see now we have different size particles. If I increase this slider a little bit, we should see an even greater variation. At least there's a lot more smaller ones. And sure, now we've got kind of a mesh of various size particles. All right, so that's okay. Let's go ahead and make these guys all emit straight upwards now by changing the directional vector, just like so. And that's in our main particle emitter. So now we have all of our particles going up. And I'll go ahead and just, let's actually disconnect that randomize on the size there for a second. And let's go ahead and add some turbulence to that by, again, going to our ice pull down. And I'll just say after emission, how about I want to turbulize the velocity? And now I get that. So that's about crazy turbulence. Let's go ahead and increase the turbulence scale, maybe make the strength quite a bit less. And now you can see we've got some very interesting behavior going on with those particles. So obviously added some turbulence to that. Pretty neato. And if we zoom out here a bit, we can see what it did is it added the turbulized particle velocity node to my execution graph here. So now let's go ahead and tweak this a little bit more. And let's go ahead and vary the age limit a little bit. So again, use our pull down, and I'll just say on emission, I want to set the age limit, and that brings up this node here, and we'll set the age limit for, say, a value of 2 seconds. But the particles haven't disappeared yet. Well, that's because I haven't told them to be deleted yet. So here I go to after emission, delete the particles at the age limit. And this brings up a very important concept within ICE, which is doing things at execution time versus doing things every frame. So here, execute on emission, we set the particle age limit. So as soon as a particle is born, we tell it how old it's allowed to be, or how long it's allowed to be alive for. And at the very first frame, it inherits that value. Then every frame, it checks to see if it reaches that age yet. So that's where it's doing this every frame. And essentially, if you plug stuff into this guy, it's every frame, and if you plug stuff into here, it's on emission, unless you plug it into certain ports. But you kind of figure all that out as you get comfortable using ICE. So anyway, now we got a little bit of variance on our age, and let's go ahead and take the turbulence off the particle velocity, and instead let's put the turbulence on the age of the particles, because right now all those particles are alive for the same amount of time. So this time, rather than use the pull down menu, I'm going to show you how you can do it here within inside of your tool tray. So what I'll do here is just type in the word turb, which will kind of filter everything that has to do with turbulence. And I'm just going to get turbulence around value. We're going to take this node and just plug that directly into age limit. And now I'm going to put a unique value, a turbulence value, on each one of those particles. So again, this is really cool. When you work with a single value, adjusting something like this, every particle is getting that value there. But as soon as you start using nodes, now each particle can have its own unique value. And these can be many programs that you write. This could be some sort of a equation, any sorts of thing. In fact, this is an algorithm that creates turbulent values. And so now I can go and maybe increase the scale of that a little bit, change the variance. I can make that animated. I maybe want those to be a bit longer even still, or a bit last a bit longer, something like that. Now this is just the turbulence for the age. We haven't actually put any turbulence on the actual particle motion. So this is just varying how long they're to be alive for. And maybe we'll just change the turbulence scale a little bit to get that a little bit more rougher, something like that. Cool. So now let's change, or now let's add one more thing, and let's go ahead and add the turbulence to the particle velocity. So to do that, we're going to grab a force. So I'll just type in the word force, and as I mentioned before, we have plenty of different forces: coagulate, drag, gravity, neighboring particle, all sorts of different forces in here. Wind, Lagoa force. I'm just going to grab the add forces node, plug that in, and now I can use any force. I could grab something like gravity and just plug that in. Oh, I plugged it in somewhere else on accident. There we go. Plug that in. Now you can see we have gravity on our particles there, which doesn't make any sense for fire. So let's just go ahead and disconnect that. But essentially, a force is any XYZ vector. So that can be anything. I could go and get a primitive null, which is just a nothing object, which we have right there. And by pressing F3, you can get a little floating explorer, and I can grab the position and just pipe that in like so. So this node here now represents the position of this null. Plug that in, and now whoop, these guys are going to follow that null, or if those particles are going to follow the null wherever it goes, which is neat but completely useless. But I did want to show you that if you delete the null, then you can see this tree turns red, telling you that something in this branch isn't there or is throwing an error. So rather than crash, it just turns red, lets you know, hey, you've got something invalid. So I'm going to delete that null, and let's instead use our good friend turbulence, and we'll just put some turbulence on our force like so. And now we get something pretty close to fire. If we just go ahead and maybe reduce some of these values a little bit, decrease the scale, turn it on animated, and we have something that looks like fire. Well, sort of fire. It's not my best fire. Let's go and do one thing, though, that'll make it look a bit better, and go get this node here called fire color, which just gives me a nice gradient fire. It's a node I created a while ago. But there you go. So we've essentially created a little bit of fire. Let's do some other stuff on here. Let's make these fire particles maybe flow around this guy instead of passing right through our cauldron there. So to do that, let's think about how to do that. Well, let's type the word flow and see if there's anything there. Hey, look at that, flow around surface. And this is what I find kind of interesting and handy about ice is, there's all these nodes, but generally if you just type a word or two or some words that kind of seem like what you want to do, you'll usually find a compound for it. And there's fantastic documentation too, which will help you out. So anyway, I'm going to plug this guy into our states here. We'll say a new execution node, flow around surface. The surface that I want to flow around is the cauldron, so just select it, press F3 to bring up a floating explorer, and just drag and drop that in. So this node here now represents that cauldron. Go and just put it in place, and now you can see this turns green, and the particles are now flowing around the bottom of the pot there. If I open this up, I have some parameters here which can control how close they get by changing, say, the cutoff distance in the weight. You can see that gets us closer or further away to the pot, like so. And if we increase or decrease the cutoff distance, it does that even better. So you can see now it's really close to the edge there. Might even be penetrating a bit. Yep, just like so. So again, just set your cutoff distance till you get that exactly the way you want. Well, you can make actually your own. If we go into the flow around surface node, there's a bunch of nodes. Let's take a look at this real quick. There's a bunch of logic in here. So this is a program. This is someone create a program that basically checks to see where the surface is and then flows around it. So we can create our own. So let's go ahead and do that. We won't create something as complicated as flow around surface, but let's just go and get an if node, and we're going to say, okay, if our particles touch the surface, then I want you to do something. Let's go back to seeing our data here. So we'll say if our particles touch this object, then go ahead and do something. So let's get a tester. Type the word test, and we can see all these different testers come up. Test inside a bounding box, test collision with this, test distance to neighbor, test distance to goal, test if it's inside of an object, test inside of an null, test its ID. All these different testers, and you can make your own testers. Well, these testers trigger conditions. So I want to do a test collision with surface. All right, cool. So let's plug that into here. The surface that I want to collide with is the cauldron. So let's go ahead and drag that in like we did before. And so there we go. So we're saying, okay, if our particle hits this cauldron, do something. Well, what do we want it to do if the statement is true? How about we want to delete? And there it is, delete particle. So grab this, plug it in there. And we kind of just wrote a very basic little program. And now let's go and just replace the this node here we were working with before, flow around surface. Let's just disconnect that. And let's replace it with our new node. We can delete flow around surface. We can delete those guys. Grab this, move it up here. Oops, I think we missed one. Oh, there we go. And now look, if we go full screen here, if I move this around, as the particles hit them, they get deleted. And move that out of the way, and there they're back. Get that in the way, and they don't flow around it. They now delete. And again, you can have them do all sorts of crazy stuff. And now what I can do is actually save this. Say I want to have this functionality later. Select all your nodes, right-click, and say create compound. And I could give it a name. I could give it some inputs. I could say test these different parameters and save it. And so now this just becomes a node, just like delete particle at age limit. This becomes something that will delete with a collision. And again, I could give it a name, delete particle on collision. There we go. And that's that. So that's how you make your own little tool there. So I'm just going to reorganize that a little bit. And what I could also do is basically do that for the entire tool here. I could grab all this stuff, right click, create a compound, and now this could be something like we'll call this super fire, and start to reveal some different parameters. Maybe let the artist be able to change the rate. How about the base value, the variance, go up, and look, now we've got those parameters there. Double click it, it already built the UI for me. And now if I go back into this guy, look, if I start exposing some of these parameters, look, it just adds right to that dialog box right on the fly. As I expose these parameters to the compound, all the different data types show up, and so that's now the new dialog box for our Superfire tool. Double click on it, and there you go. So when I was talking about that whole artist friendly, TD friendly. That's really kind of what I was getting at. Is you can make a tool, give it to someone on your team, and there you go. So that's a little bit how we make a tool, how you can, some of the workflows involved with ice. Well, I want to show you one more thing, and that's working with a specific particle type, and that's a Lagoa particle. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. And we'll do that by unveiling our little bunny rabbit friend here from our buddies at Janimation. And why is the rabbit in the cauldron? Well, I want to show you off, as I mentioned, Lagoa. So what Lagoa allows you to do is basically control particles in a very different way. And I'm just going to hide our fire there for just a second. And I'm just going to select my little rabbit here. We're going to say ice. I want to create. And here we have several different types of Lagoa materials. So I'm just going to do a throw breakable structure first. And it's asking me to select some collision obstacles. So what I've done here is I've taken the cauldron, the ground, and the rocks and put them all in a group called collisions. So I'm just going to click on that. And that's going to pop up this dialog box, which is for these tools right here. And what I'm first going to do is just get rid of the velocity, the initial force that's on our Lagoa sim. So what that does is, let's just hide our rabbit, and I'll do a little explaining here. Lagoa will take the shape of your emitter and basically create a particle emitter where all the particles are literally tied to one another. So they're all interconnected through mathematics to control how elastic they are, how viscous they are, and you can do some really, really cool things with them based on these different materials. So if I go and select my compound and blow it up, so let's explode it. Let's take a look here. This material right here has all these different parameters that are controlling how this guy splits up and all these different things that happen to it. Now the resolution right now is fairly low, so we don't see a whole lot of particles. So first let's go ahead and change their shape to a sphere. This will allow us to see those interconnections a little easier. And also let's go ahead and increase the resolution. And if I stop it real quick and we zoom in, it's a little hard to see, but you can see all these little yellow lines. Those are the connection points between each particle. And as I lower the resolution, which is this node right here, as I lower the resolution, we get more particles because we're decreasing the size. So that basically is the size of each object. The smaller this gets, the longer it takes it to sim, but the cooler or the more exciting that simulation is. And all of this can be surfaced. There's a quick little tool that allows you to surface this. And a neat little trick of the day is, when I'm working with simulations that start to get a little heavy like this one does, I do a little trick. So the trick is to save your scene. So I'm going to call this one, we'll just save it over top of itself. And then go ahead and with your point cloud selected, this guy right there, go ice, simulation, save cache on selection. And what that'll basically do is store each frame on the hard drive. And now if I go and launch another Softimage and load that same scene back up, now it's still creating the scene in the background, or creating the cache. But now what I can do is grab that cache and go simulation load cache. And now if I back this up, press play. Now obviously I need to increase my substeps there a little bit, but you can see my old cache mixed in with my new cache. And this is really cool. As you build more, those shooting out are your substep level. As you increase the resolution of your creature, you need to increase your substep levels as well as you get some stray ones shooting. That one's kind of comical. But what's neat here is, again, the whole simulation is occurring in the background, and I'm able to now scrub the simulation because, again, because I'm using a cache file now. And I think that was his ear? That's part of his face. So let's go ahead here and go back to our other soft that's still processing, and let's switch some stuff out here. Let's, instead of using this default material, let's type in the word material, and we can see some other Lagoa materials that we have: highly breakable, jello, splashy water. Let's try jello. Let's take jello, let's replace that material, and let's see what happens when we use some jello. Maybe just increase this to like 0.3 or so, and let's see what the jello looks like. This can be kind of funny. Let's actually hide the collision object and just see how it curls around and snaps his neck back. And again, that could be a cache that we've seen. So let me try one other thing. I'm going to load up a different version. Here's that one played back a bit quicker with the cache playing off the hard disk, of course. But it's nice because obviously you can scrub it now. And there I had the sub steps set at the proper level. And you can see you get a pretty cool thing. But again, that can all be surfaced to actually look like a real thing. I had fun making some of these. But unfortunately, they're just playing back with this software running to record. It's just lost on my frame rate, so I'm not showing you all of them. One other one real quick. So lastly, again with Lagoa, I just wanted to show you one pretty cool thing. So here I've enabled one parameter, one checkbox called Enable Elasticity. And when you do that, you can basically get objects to stick to the collision obstacles, and you can literally rip them in half like we're doing there. In fact, if I go and just unhide the cache for that one and run it again, you can see it. Here I've got quite a few more particles. And we're just going to grab him. I like the way his ears stick. Bonk. And his legs just sort of dangle. And then roop. And then here, he just pretty much just gets ripped in half. Snap. Anyway, pretty cool stuff. So that's Lagoa. Just while I have this scene up, you can take... if I unhide the non-cache version and we just select our cube here, I'm going to remove all the animation from it, press simulate, and just catch this guy. And look, I can do all this interactively in real time. And in a second, the keyframes on the, well, I didn't really, well, let's do that again. There's keyframes on the elasticity, so when we get to around frame 100, you're going to see these guys start to snap, just like so. And that's all this on keyframe. So anyway, just some fun to have with Lagoa, fun to have with ice. It's super cool just to tool around and noodle around, learn the system. Basically, you spend just a little bit of time each day and you'll become a master in no time. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the 3 product demos today by Lee Fraser, Louis Marcoux, and myself. And hope to see you at another Autodesk webinar soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. So thank you all for watching today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Remember that if you want to find out more about Lee, myself, and Mark, you can visit our blogs on Area. It's area.autodesk.com/blogs. And if you're a student watching this and you want to learn more about our student program, which consists of 36 months licenses for free, if you're a student, so you can visit autodesk.com/education/free software. And if you want to try any of those software that we've shown you today, you got the 30-day trials for Maya, Max, and Softimage, so you can go and download them immediately. So thank you for watching again. Remember that there's Cave coming up in the beginning of December, where you can learn a lot more about our software as well. So thank you very much for watching, and enjoy the rest of the day.